history holes.
Imagine a city the size of Philadelphia or Barcelona. 2 million people live there. There are schools, markets, temples, and traffic jams. Now imagine that in the span of 24 hours, every single person vanishes. The coffee is left warm on the tables. The laundry is still hanging on the lines. The money is left in the drawers. But the people are gone. There are no cars, no voices. Just the wind blowing through the empty boulevards and the traffic lights blinking red and green for nobody. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. This actually happened. In 1975, a group of shadowy revolutionaries achieved the ultimate victory. They didn't just conquer a country, they tried to conquer time itself. They reset the calendar. They declared that history was over. They called it Year Zero. They believed that to build a perfect world, they had to destroy the old one completely. And they started by emptying the capital city. This is the story of the day the world went quiet. The black pajamas. It is the morning of April 17, 1975. The city is Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. The sun is beating down and the humidity is thick enough to choke on. The city is swollen, bursting at the seams. Refugees from the countryside have flooded in to escape the civil war, doubling the population. For weeks, they have been hearing the artillery thumping in the distance, getting closer every day. The city is terrified. But on this morning, the shelling stops. A strange silence falls over the rooftops, and then from the outskirts they appear. They walk down the main boulevards in single file. They are soldiers, but they don't look like a regular army. They are wearing black peasant pajamas. They have no rank insignias. Around their necks, they wear red and white checkered scarves, called kramas, and on their feet they wear sandals made from old car tires. But the most terrifying thing about them is their faces. They are children. Most of them are teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old. They have dead, unblinking eyes. They don't smile. They don't speak. They just march, carrying AK-47s that look too big for their bodies. At first, the people of Phnom Penh are relieved. They cheer. They wave white flags. They think the war is finally over. The shopkeepers open their doors. The mothers hold up their babies. They offer the soldiers water and cigarettes. The soldiers do not take the water. They do not smile back. Within an hour, the celebration turns into confusion, and then the confusion turns into panic. The soldiers raise their megaphones. Their voices crackle through the humid air. They don't give a victory speech. They give an order. Leave the city immediately. The people are stunned. Leave where? Why? The soldiers give a reason. It is a lie, but it is a clever one. They say, "The Americans are going to bomb the city. You must evacuate for your own safety. Do not pack anything. You will be back in 3 days. Just go. Now. The Americans are coming. The sky will fall." It is a stampede. The soldiers start firing their guns into the air. They are not asking. They are hurting. Families scramble to grab what they can. A bag of rice, a pot, a blanket. They lock their front doors, thinking they will be back by the weekend. They leave their gold hidden under the floorboards. They pour out of their houses and into the streets. The avenues of Phnom Penh, usually filled with bicycles and cyclos, become a solid river of human beings. The Khmer Rouge have arrived, and the experiment has begun. Part 2, the River of Pain. The order to evacuate was absolute. There were no exceptions. If you were eating lunch, you left your spoon in the bowl. If you were changing your clothes, you walked out half-dressed. But the true horror began when the soldiers reached the hospitals. Phnom Penh's hospitals were overflowing with the wounded from the war. There were thousands of amputees, burn victims, and patients recovering from surgery. The teenage soldiers walked into the wards with their rifles raised. They looked at the doctors, men and women who had spent years saving lives, and pointed to the door. "Everybody out," they said. The doctors pleaded, "These people are dying. They cannot walk. They need blood. They need oxygen." The soldiers didn't care. To them, compassion was a weakness. Medicine was a tool of the West. They went bed to bed, forcing the patients onto the floor. They pushed gurneys out into the blinding sun. They disconnected IV drips and shoved them into the hands of family members, telling them to hold the bags up while they walked. The scene on the main boulevard was a vision from hell. It was a slow-moving river of misery. 2 million people, shoulder to shoulder, shuffling toward the city gates. The heat was over 100 degrees. The dust kicked up by millions of feet turned the air into a brown fog. You saw fathers pushing hospital beds with their dying sons on them. You saw women carrying their grandmothers on their backs. You saw children wandering alone, crying for parents they had lost in the crush, and watching them from the sidewalks were the black pajamas. These child soldiers watched the suffering with zero emotion. If a car stalled in the traffic, they didn't help push it. They tipped it over into the ditch to clear the path. If a patient fell off a stretcher and couldn't get up, the crowd was forced to walk over them. The hierarchy of the world had been flipped upside down. For decades, the city people, the teachers, the merchants, the engineers had looked down on the country peasants. They saw them as backward and uneducated. Now the peasants had the guns, and they were taking their revenge. As the sun began to set on that first day, the people of Phnom Penh started to realize the truth. The soldiers had said, 3 days, but they were forcing them miles past the city limits, deep into the rice paddies. They looked back at their city, seeing the smoke rising from the horizon. They didn't know it yet, but they were never going back. The city was dying, and among the crowd a new fear was spreading. People were starting to hide their identities. They were ripping up their diplomas. They were throwing away their IDs, because they realized that in this new world, being smart was a death sentence. Part 3, the enemy of the state. As the millions of exhausted refugees stumbled into the countryside, they began to hear a new word. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a political party, it was a faceless, shapeless god. They called it Angkar. Angkar means the organization. The soldiers didn't say, I order you. They said, Angkar requires it. Angkar was the mother and the father. Angkar provided, and Angkar took away. And Angkar had eyes like a pineapple. It saw everything. The leaders of this organization, men like Pol Pot, were hiding in the shadows. They had a vision that was so radical, so insane, that nobody could comprehend it. They wanted to reset the clock. They declared year zero. In their new world, everything that came before was evil. The modern world was a disease. The city was a tumor. To cure the country, they had to cut it all out. They abolished money. In the first few days, the Khmer Rouge soldiers blew up the National Bank of Cambodia in Phnom Penh. Millions of real notes rained down on the streets, but nobody picked them up. In an instant, cash was just paper. It was worthless. They abolished religion. Monks were forced to take off their orange robes and work in the fields. Statues of Buddha were beheaded. They abolished the family. Children were taken from their parents to be raised by the state. You were not supposed to love your mother. You were supposed to love Angkar. But the most dangerous thing of all was the mind. Angkar divided the country into 2 groups. There were the old people, the peasants, the farmers, the uneducated. They were considered pure. And there were the new people, the city dwellers, the teachers, the engineers, the mechanics, the students. They were the parasites. The Khmer Rouge believed that knowledge was corruption. If you spoke French, you were a spy. If you had soft hands, you were lazy. And then there was the symbol of the enemy, a pair of eyeglasses. To the teenage soldiers, glasses were proof that you read books. If you read books, you thought too much. And if you thought too much, you were a threat to the revolution. On the long march out of the city, a terrifying phenomenon began. Intellectuals, doctors, and professors realized they were being hunted. They stopped speaking in full sentences. They threw away their diplomas in the ditches. They rubbed dirt and grease on their hands to make them look rough and calloused. And they took off their glasses. Men who were nearly blind without them took their spectacles, threw them on the ground, and crushed the lenses with their heels. They chose to stumble through the world in a blur rather than be identified as smart. Because in year zero, intelligence was not an asset, it was a crime. Part 4, the Ghost Town. By the evening of April 19, 1975, just 48 hours after the soldiers arrived, the job was done. Phnom Penh, the Pearl of Asia, was empty. 2 million people had been flushed out like water from a pipe. The boulevards that had been clogged with traffic and humanity were now completely silent. The silence was the most terrifying part. It wasn't the peace of a holiday. It was the silence of a grave. If you walked down Monavong Boulevard on that day, you would have seen a surreal still-life painting of a civilization interrupted. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the road, doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. In the markets, stalls were full of rotting fruit. In the restaurants, bowls of noodle soup sat on tables, dried and crusted over, with chopsticks resting on the rim. The wind blew through the empty streets, kicking up swirls of dust and trash, and mixed in with the trash was money. Millions of banknotes, the real, fluttered in the gutters. A fortune in cash was lying on the pavement, but there was nobody left to pick it up. It had less value than the dried leaves falling from the trees. The only movement came from nature. Without the noise of engines and the smell of gasoline, the jungle began to reclaim the city almost immediately. Wild monkeys came down from the temple trees and ran across the empty intersections. Packs of stray dogs roamed the diplomatic quarter, sleeping on the sofas of abandoned embassies. Weeds began to crack through the asphalt. For the next 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, Phnom Penh remained a ghost town. A small group of Khmer Rouge officials lived in the center, paranoid and secretive, guarding a capital with no citizens. They turned the high schools into torture centers and the libraries into pigsties. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the new people were learning the brutal reality of year zero. They were forced to dig canals by hand, working 16 hours a day on a bowl of watery rice gruel. They died by the thousands from starvation, malaria, and execution. The 3 days the soldiers promised turned into an eternity. Most of them never saw their homes again. The evacuation of Phnom Penh remains one of the most radical and destructive social experiments in human history. It was the day a government declared war on its own existence. They tried to restart time. They tried to build a utopia by erasing the past. But all they succeeded in creating was a graveyard. And for those few years, under the baking sun of Southeast Asia, the silent city stood as a hollow monument to their madness, a place where the traffic lights kept blinking red and green, signaling to a world that was no longer there. I thank you very much for joining us on this journey. I hope to see you in the next one.